Good evening and welcome to Yitzutzos, Sparks, and the Parsha, Tidbits of Torah Knowledge on the weekly Torah portion. This week we read the portion called Re'ei. Re'ei, the very name of this Parsha already elicits some type of surprise, because if you know what the word Re'ei means, which is see, visual, and you contrast that with so many other verses in the Torah, which focuses on Shema, hear or listen. Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel. And here it's Re'ei, here it's visualizing. Well, Judaism comes in two forms. There's the audio part of Judaism, and there's the visual part of Judaism. For most of our history, the audio aspect of Judaism was much more pronounced, because Judaism is not just reading the text, it's part of it, but it's mainly listening to the teachers of Torah who transmitted the oral tradition from Moses, who got it at Sinai, all the way down to the present day and age. And yes, oral Torah was eventually put into writing, but there's a misconception. Number one, not all of the oral Torah was put into writing. Much of it was lost. Many of the laws and teachings were lost. Many of them are still being passed down orally. The flavor, the color, the nuances can only be captured by a living transmitter of knowledge. So Judaism throughout history was an audio religion. We focused on that which we can hear and understand, but there's also an element of Re'ei, of visual. There are some visual aspects to Judaism. Of course, we look at the Torah, the written Torah, the Torah scroll. We look at the mezuzah, we look at the tefillin, and likewise many other aspects of Judaism that are visual. But in terms of teaching Torah, it's mostly an audio. What is Moses trying to introduce over here? Moses is saying to the Jewish people, yes, I know until now we focused on the listening, and in fact in this very verse it also returns back to the concept of listening. It says, see, I present before you today a blessing and a curse. And then it continues in the next verse, the blessing that you hearken, which is an archaic word for you will hear or listen to the commandments of God your God. And that term is used again and again. So in the very same context where the audio is mentioned, hearing, listening, we also read the seeing aspect of it. So in Hasidic philosophy, it explains that there are two ways of looking at Torah. Yes, there's the way that we learn Torah by hearing it, but there's also a deeper way that is visual, where you could see the whole picture at once. The Arizal, the great Kabbalist, took a nap one Shabbos afternoon. When he woke up, he said that in that hour or so that he had this experience in his sleep, he was able to learn the mystical teachings of the portion of the Torah that deals with Balak and Bilam. They would take him, I think it says 60 to 80 years to have to repeat it if he would repeat it in the normal way of communication. That means what he was able to see could take months and years that ordinarily, if you hear something, it doesn't take that long to reproduce it, to replicate it. In other words, take a simple example. Someone buys this beautiful painting by some master artist, and you get two people to look at that piece of art. You get a simple person who's not a connoisseur of art, and you get an art professor, someone who's a real connoisseur. You give them 5 minutes to look at it. Then you ask the simple person, the average person, could you describe in the most vivid detail what you saw in that painting? And you could have told him before that that's what he's going to have to do. He can talk about it for a few minutes. But the connoisseur, the expert, the scholar of art, while he only saw the picture for the same 5 minutes, could probably wax eloquent about that picture for hours and hours. Why? Because when you see something, you see the totality of it. And that's what makes it even more profound than something that you hear. Yes, we begin with hearing, because hearing is much more attuned to the spiritual, to the intellectual and spiritual. But after we have the hearing, we have to then develop the way of seeing it, because seeing has another advantage. Besides the fact that you see the totality of it, it has another advantage. And to understand that advantage, we have to first introduce a law mentioned in the Talmud and codified by Jewish authorities on law. And that is that if a person sees the commission of a crime, you're a witness to it, you cannot be the judge in that particular case, because you will not be able to find some way of exonerating that person. One of the rules concerning a judge is that he has to serve not only as the person to judge guilt or innocence, he has to look for ways, for extenuating circumstances that would point to the direction of acquittal. It's only when he cannot possibly find that does he have to render the decision for the conviction of the criminal. Now, he has to have an open mind, in other words. And even though he hears witnesses, reliable witnesses, testifying that they saw this individual committing a crime, he can still have an open mind. But if he saw the actual commission of the crime, it leaves an indelible imprint on his psyche that it will be very hard, if not impossible, for him to see the good side and to try to find a way of getting this person vindicated. So visual means you become one with the thing that you saw, to the point that it's part of your consciousness now. It's not just information that you accumulated, that you integrated into your mind, but it becomes an inseparable part of you. And that is how we're told Mashiach will teach Torah to all of the Jewish people, from Moses down to the simplest Jew, in a visual manner, because that way, number one, everyone will be able to get the same picture. Moses will not get more of it than the simple Jew, yet Moses, of course, will be able to articulate what he saw better than those who are inferior to him in knowledge. But a second thing is that we will become inseparable from the teachings of Torah. Now, in this verse, God says, "See, I present before you today a blessing and a curse." God is giving us a choice. Some Hasidic commentators said the word today, if you juxtapose it with blessing and curse, you could also translate that to mean that a day, today, Hayom, today, could either be a blessing or a curse. It depends how you translate the word Hayom. The word Hayom appears in the Torah in the context of following God's voice. Hayom, today, in Tishmu B'koli, if you hearken to my voice. So a person, when he hears the word Hayom, today, wakes up in the morning and says, today is a day when I will transform everything in my life into daylight. And we'll soon talk about the eclipse. When we talk about daylight, the sun, it reminds us of the eclipse that we're going to see, or hear about at least, on this coming Monday, Miras Hashem. And bracha uklola could also be a curse, because there's another verse that says, let us eat and drink and be merry today, because we don't know what will happen tomorrow. Tomorrow we may die. Very famous biblical verse. So the yom, the word today, the urgency of the day, could either be a blessing if we translate that into positive action, or God forbid it could be the opposite. Now in the Aramaic translation called Onkelos was a famous convert to Judaism, the nephew of Hadrian, the Roman emperor, and he translated the Torah into the vernacular of that time, Aramaic, and to this day, almost every edition of the 5 books of Moses in Hebrew, and so many in other languages as well, will contain Onkelos, which is on the side over here. And in fact, we are required to read the weekly Torah portion before Shabbos, twice the Torah portion and once Onkelos. So that's done by hundreds of thousands of Jews to this day. So Onkelos, who gives us a very simple, straightforward, literal translation of the Torah, deviates from that in this verse. I'm sorry, Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel, the other translator of the Torah, deviates from the normal translation. Let's see. Normally, the word for curse in Hebrew is levatin. That's the Aramaic translation. But over here, the translator, the Yonason, I stand corrected, translates it as vichilufa, and its exchange, or its opposite. In all other places, he translates the word klola as Unclus does, levatin. That's a simple translation. But Yonason translates it as the chilufa, the exchange, the opposite. And the Rebbe explains that when the Torah speaks about a curse, generally speaking, curse is a curse, is levatin, a negative term. But when God says, behold, I am giving you today a bracha, a blessing, you can't then say and a klal and a curse. God does not give us curses. But what it means is that God gives us blessings. We have the capacity to take the blessing for what it's worth, for its true value, and keep that blessing, preserve it, or God forbid, we have the power to exchange it, to reverse it to something that it was not intended to be. We could turn the blessing into something negative. To go on, the Torah talks about how we will come into this land, and we're supposed to be wary of the inhabitants of the land and their customs. We have to destroy their idolatrous temples and everything that is associated with idolatry. In the Torah, idolatry is considered to be the greatest scourge, the greatest evil. Not only is it total betrayal of the belief in one God, who is the source of our whole existence, it's a spiritual form of adultery, but it also leads to all forms of immorality. Because once a person believes in other gods, he can create a God in his own image and perpetuate his own immoral behavior by pointing to a God that parallels his or her own behavior. Now, the Torah then continues to talk about various laws that will apply in the land of Israel, and then it goes into the type of prophet that might arise in the Jewish community. And he will perform miracles. And the miracles will be real miracles. And he tries to get you to turn away from God. Don't listen to this prophet. This is an admonition that is prefaced by the words, do not add on to the commandments and do not subtract. One of the strong points of Judaism, because every religion, you have to believe, and it's well documented, traces itself back to one or a few individuals. And these individuals were obviously charismatic people. They were able to perhaps perform a few magic tricks. They were able to persuade people to follow them. They got a small following. The small following attracted a larger following. And it grows exponentially until you can have 1 billion people following that particular belief system. It doesn't prove that it's true just because it has so many followers. Judaism, by contrast, traces itself back not to one person. Yes, one person, Abraham, was the first Jew, but our Judaism is not based on Abraham. Abraham planted the seeds. Our Judaism is based on the experience we had at Mount Sinai, where we heard God directly speak to us, and we heard God summon Moses onto the mountain, choosing him to be the transmitter of the Torah to the Jewish people, the written as well as the oral Torah, and that was passed down from generation to generation. No one would ever make up a story that millions of people of all sorts of backgrounds and disparate ways of thinking have all experienced the same thing. This story could never have been made up, as the Kuzri argues, and this is not the time and place to go into that. So that's one of the beautiful things about Judaism. But what happens when someone comes along and shows supernatural powers and uses them to sway us to abandon some of the teachings of Judaism? That could happen in any system because people are very much prone to be influenced by people who can pull those tricks. And these are not just tricks, these are miraculous occurrences, bringing the dead back to life, walking on water. Who knows what else people were able to do in order to get people to follow them. So the Torah clearly says this has been anticipated. There will be a phenomenon like this. There will be people who will try to use prophetic powers to take us astray. So the question is, so then what role does prophecy have? If a prophet would come along today and tell us that he just received a prophetic message from God saying that we should no longer observe the Shabbos on Saturday, we should do it on Sunday or any other day of the week, and he performs these miracles, and he's known to be a very spiritual person, a very conscientious person, what are we supposed to do? So the Torah makes it very clear that we do not follow a prophet when he contradicts the giving of the Torah, because the ultimate prophet is Moses. And in that document that Moses got from God, namely this week's Torah portion, as well as other places, it is made very clear that there is no such thing as a prophet who can tell us to turn away from God and from his teachings that were already established at Mount Sinai. So that's the issue of prophecy. In fact, the prophet, according to Maimonides, can't even mix into a scholarly discussion about matters of Jewish law and say that I had a vision last night in which God told me to favor opinion A over opinion B. Yes, the prophet could be a scholar, and if he uses scholarship to argue that particular opinion, that's fine. But when he's wearing the hat of a prophet, that may not come to change Judaism. That's what preserved Judaism for all these centuries, and people couldn't understand. How come we didn't embrace this religion or that religion? They had such charismatic people. They did so many great things and miracles even. That does not sway us. Does that mean we don't believe in miracles? Absolutely not. Does that mean we don't believe in prophets? Absolutely not. The next week's Torah portion of the Torah clearly speaks about the existence of prophets in the Jewish people. And next week we'll talk a little bit more about the role of prophecy and what is its role today in this particular period that we're in right now. Then the Torah goes on to talk about the laws of kashrus, dietary laws, which were already mentioned in the book of Leviticus. But as we know, the book of Deuteronomy is a restatement of the Torah, Mishnah Torah. God, through Moses, is restating the Torah. Moses is doing it with God's inspiration, as opposed to the other four books where God is just speaking through Moses. He was just the mouthpiece. But at any rate, this is divinely inspired words that Moses is reiterating the laws of kashrus. And they conclude with words, don't cook a kid in the milk of its mother, which is the prohibition against milk and meat. Now, it's interesting how the misconception that many people have that the laws of kashrus are health laws. Moses apparently had a degree in biology, and he knew that pigs could give you trichinosis, and therefore don't eat pig. Likewise, other prohibited substances because of his knowledge of biology. And of course, that's ridiculous. Moses, we don't have any evidence that he knew more about biology than people of his time. But what he did know is what God had told him, that this is a way of becoming a holy nation, not for health reasons. Yes, keeping kosher may have a lot of fringe benefits. One of them is good health, but that's not the reason we keep kosher. What it is it starts off by saying, you are God's children. And in the next verse, you should be holy unto God your God. God chose you from amongst the nations. And then he goes on to say, don't eat any abominations, and these are the animals that you could eat, and so on and so forth. So we see clearly that the entire concept of kashrus is based on the notion of holiness. We are a holy and unique people. There's a midrash that says that the nations of the world, this is maybe a prophecy about the future, will come to Jerusalem and they will see how we have our own diet. We keep kosher, and that will so inspire them that they will want to convert to Judaism. In other words, the dietary laws is something that brings special admiration, elicits admiration from others, that we maintain our own diet regardless of where we are and what the conditions are. Now, amongst the forbidden birds, I'm going to just focus on one of these verses is a bird that is mentioned in chapter 14, verse 13, and it has three different names. According to Rashi, it's the same bird with three different names because of three different characteristics, which we'll soon see. It's probably a vulture, and the three names are Re'ei, Aya, and Daya. Re'ei comes from the word seeing. Why is it called a seeing bird? It ties in with Re'ei, but this is the negative seeing. It's a non-kosher bird because it sees very well. This is the vulture. The Talmud says the vulture could be standing in Babylonia and it sees a dead carcass in Israel. Well, what does that mean spiritually? The negative characteristics of these non-kosher animals and birds describe a negative characteristic about a human being as well. And that is, the vulture characteristic is where we could be looking in Israel, in a holy place, and what do we see? We see the negative. That's the tendency that sometimes we have. We look at another person. The other Jew is someone who was filled with virtue, filled with holiness, filled with positive qualities. But we look at that person, and what do? We find the dead carcass. We see the negative. We see all too well. Good sight is admirable. It's desirable. But to use our good sight to see the positive, not the negative. That's one non-kosher characteristic. We see the negative in everything around us. Yes, there's so much negative in our society, but we should focus on the positive. And when we elicit positive energy, it will dispel the negative. A lot of light dispels, a little light rather, especially a lot of light dispels much more darkness. The Aya, the word Aya comes from the word Aye. Where is it? It's when people abandon the path of righteousness because they think it's beyond their reach. They think it's not practical. It's a pipe dream. Where is it? Come on, don't try to tell me I should behave in a certain way. That's not realistic. Let's be realistic about things. So this is another negative tendency that we sometimes put good people on a pedestal, but so high up that we're not willing to emulate them, to even look at them. Our focus instead is on those who are below us, to see, oh, I'm much better than the other person because I'm doing something the other person isn't doing, and that person has these faults. And the Aya is the person who says, I can't go up, I can't look up because it's too high for me. Then you have the Daya. The Daya comes from the word dai, as in dayenu, it's enough. Many people carve out a comfortable niche in their lives, and they say, I am good enough. It's not that they don't want to look up to someone above them. It's not that they're looking at the negative beneath them. They are just content, complacent. While it comes to making money, they're always willing to make more. They'll always do whatever they have to do to improve their health and whatever other aspects of life that they deem important. But it seems that when it comes to morality and spirituality and religiosity, people find a comfortable niche. The Daya, that's a sign of a non-kosher bird. Bird is a symbol of flying up high, and the word tzipor in Hebrew, which is the word used for a kosher bird, has the same numerical value as the word shalom, or the word zem Mashiach. This is the Mashiach. This is a very high level. To make it kosher, you can't have these three negative characteristics. Seeing the negative in others, never wanting to look up above you, and always being content with whatever level you're at. It concludes, as I said before, with a prohibition, don't cook a kid in the milk of its mother. Now this prohibition appears 3 times in the Torah, twice in the book of Exodus and once here. The Talmud says that the reason for this is because there were 3 separate prohibitions. Number 1, you can't cook it, which is what it says. Number 2, you can't eat it if you did cook it. And number 3, you cannot even derive any benefit from it. It cannot be given to your animal, for example. You can't sell it. it can't be used as fertilizer. You have to get rid of it. There's nothing else you can do with it. Now, one may suggest that the three occurrences of this prohibition correspond to three different reasons given for not using this mixture of milk and meat, not cooking it, not eating it, or consuming it in any way, benefiting from it in any way. The three reasons, although the ultimate reason is because it's God's commandment, and many consider this to be a chok, a commandment that is beyond reason, but nevertheless, reasons have been given in order to make us not just fulfill this mitzvah, but allow the mitzvah to inform us, to inspire us, to educate us. One reason is given that in the olden days, idol worshippers would cook a kid in the milk of its mother as part of their ritual. Maimonides says that many of the commandments of the Torah are there to keep us away from any form of idolatry, distance us from it as much as possible. That explains why we shouldn't cook the kid in the milk of its mother, which is what the pagans used to do. Then there's another reason given, that cooking a kid, a young animal, in the milk of its mother is cruel. It's sadistic. You're killing the animal, the child, the offspring, and the irony of it, the sick irony of it, is you're doing it in the milk of its mother, the milk that nurtures it. Instead of being the source of life, it's the source of the death of the offspring. So it's there to get us to get rid of every vestige of cruelty in our own lives. Not just cruelty to the animal, but cruelty to other people as well. That means the trait of cruelty has to be eradicated, and every time we keep kosher and we separate milk and meat, if the spiritual reasons don't satisfy you, this reason should satisfy any conscientious person. That this is a way of saying, I do care about the feelings of others. I do not harbor any cruelty, any sadism, any desire to take revenge, any type of hatred, especially hatred that can lead to violence, which is something that we're seeing so much in our society. The third reason is a more mystical reason, that God created the world with certain forces. Milk and meat represent two different forces. When you cook it, you're destroying the uniqueness of each of those forces. Now, in many areas of life, it's a good thing to synthesize, but the Torah tells us there are certain things that are negative when they synthesize them. So corresponding to these three reasons, we have three prohibitions: not to cook it, not to consume it, because by consuming it, you are acquiring the negative traits that are associated with that mixture, and not even benefiting from it, which would be a way of distancing ourselves from even any form of mixing up of different forces. There are several ways of attaching it to those three different prohibitions, but the point is that we have three different reasons. We're going to skip over to a section where the Torah speaks about the importance of giving tzedakah. And it starts off with a verse, this is in chapter 15, verse 7. There will be amongst you a poor man in one of your brothers, in one of your gates, in your land that God gives you. Don't harden your heart, and don't close your hands from your brother, the poor man. It goes on to say, open your hands and give him, and goes on to elaborate on the importance of helping the poor and the needy. Now, before we go into some of the aspects of helping the poor literally, there's a beautiful commentary by the Or HaChaim, the great Sephardic sage who lived about 250 years ago, of Chaim ben Attar. And he explains this verse allegorically. He says that, who is the poor man? The poor man? Mashiach. Mashiach is described in the book of Zechariah as a poor man riding on a donkey. Someone who is humble. Someone who is poor. Why is he poor? Because he is so hurting that the Jewish people is still in exile, and there's pain and suffering in the world. He feels that pain more than anyone else. He's afflicted. He's a poor man, a very needy person. And he is one of our brothers. The word one of our brothers means a very special one of our brothers. And what does he want more than anything else? He wants to be able to be told by God, it's time for you to liberate the Jewish people. But it depends a lot on us. When we ask for Mashiach, when we demand Mashiach, when we live our lives in a way that makes us worthy of Mashiach, that is the way we help this poor man. And the Or Chaim concludes this commentary very interestingly. In this edition, it doesn't have it, but it's very interesting that they took it out. But the Or Chaim writes in the original edition, when he talks about Mashiach, says Shmo Chaim. His name is Chaim. Now, who is he referring to? Many understood this to mean that he was referring to himself. What does that mean? Well, the Talmud says that in every generation, there is one person who is worthy of being the Mashiach. If the people are worthy, he will become the Mashiach and take them out of exile. And the Or Chaim was pointing to himself, and as if he's begging, he's saying, I'm the poor man, I'm begging you, please do whatever you have to do to bring Mashiach, to allow me to reveal myself. But even on a other level, what he's telling us is that Mashiach will introduce the true notion of Chaim, of life, to the world. Because life in exile is not true life, because we're lacking all of what we're lacking. And this is what ties in with the idea of an eclipse. The eclipse is where the moon blocks the light of the sun. The sun is compared as an analogy for God's light. In the book of Psalms, King David says, Ki shemesh u'magen Hashem Elokim, because God is like the sun and the sheath of the sun. It means God has two ways of communicating his energy to us. One is like the sun, powerful rays, and then we also have the sheath that covers up the sun. And the moon, in this case, becomes the shield that keeps the light of the sun from us. And this is what we want removed. We want that blockage removed, that the whole world could see God's light. The Talmud says that whenever there's a lunar eclipse, it's not a good sign for the Jewish people. It's a sign for us to shape up, because we are likened to the moon. But when there's a solar eclipse, it's a bad sign for the nations of the world. What does that mean? In a spiritual sense, that means it's a signal to all humanity that God's light is not being fully revealed. You're doing things to block out God's light. Please start to shape up, follow the 7 Noahide commandments, and that will allow God's light to shine brightly to the whole world. The Torah then goes on to talk about the various holidays. This is one of the few places in the Torah, several places, where all the holidays are discussed. But when it talks about the holiday of Sukkot, it doesn't mention the last day, which is Shmini Atzeres, the 8th day, which is its own holiday attached to the holiday of Sukkot. But it doesn't mention that. It only hints to it when it says that you shall rejoice, celebrate for 7 days, and v'hayisa ach sameach, you shall be only happy. Now usually the word ach means diminish something, but, only. And here it says it includes that then after the 7 days you have to continue the celebration to the next day. And the Rebbe says that this is a powerful symbol, that we're taking the ach, the negative, and we're turning it into simcha, into joy. And that even though the word ach usually means that we're diminishing something, it means to say that Shmini Atzeres diminishes the joy of Sukkot, that compared to Shmini Atzeres, Sukkot is a diminished level of joy. That's why we have the custom on Simchas Torah, which is the diaspora extension of Shmini Atzeres, as the happiest holiday in the whole year, because this is a holiday that isn't even mentioned clearly in the Torah in this context. It's mentioned in other places, because this holiday has a unique quality of joy that no other holiday has. And the Torah continues, 3 times a year all of the males shall appear before God in all the 3 pilgrimage holidays, and do not show your face empty-handed. Every person, according to the blessing that God has given him, should bring to Jerusalem. May we soon see the fulfillment of this commandment, and we all travel to Jerusalem for the next holiday, and even before that, with Mashiach at our head. Have a good night, and a good Shabbos, and a good Rosh Chodesh Elul, which is coming up on Tuesday and Wednesday.